Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the first lecture that we're going to be talking about in our new unit, which is cell biology. And the topic that we're going to be talking about today is cell theory. So to start off cell theory, we actually want to talk a little bit about the theory itself so that you guys understand what the theory is talking about. So if we go into our slideshow here, cell theory states three major things. The first idea or postulate, so ideas, you might hear me call them postulates, because in science we formulate main ideas called postulates. And these ideas behind cell theory are that all organisms are composed of one or more cells. All right, so all organisms are composed of one or more cells. The cells are the most basic fundamental unit of life. Okay, what that means is that at the most basic level, they are the thing that performs all the life functions. So a cell is more basic than, let's say, a human being, because a human being is very complex. We have organs, organ systems, all those things. And we undergo digestion, synthesis, and all those different life functions, reproduction. We have specific structures for those. Cells are basically a microscopic equivalent of a human body. They are only made up of one cell, though, but they have structures in them that also perform the life function. So, at the most basic level, they perform the life functions. We'll talk about how they do that in a little bit. And the last major idea is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. And the way they do that is through reproduction. Now, cells do it through things called like cellular division, like mitosis and meiosis, which we'll talk about as our last topic in this unit. But the process of reproduction is how cells reproduce through mitosis and meiosis. So let's give you a little example. Cells come in many sizes, so sometimes it's hard to visualize what a cell actually is. Well, they're very, very, very small. And we're going to be looking at some different size cells under microscopes in lab this unit. But cells come in many basic shapes and sizes. The typical cell ranges in size from about 5 to 50 micrometers. And you might be wondering or asking yourself, what the heck is a micrometer? Well, to give you some perspective, 1,000 micrometers, this is the symbol for micrometer. So 1,000 micrometers is equivalent to 1 millimeter. Think about a millimeter. Think of how small that is. 1 micrometer, okay, is 1,000th of a millimeter. So it's very, very, very small. And your average cell ranges from about 5 to 50 micrometers, with the tiniest of bacteria, so things that you can barely even see under a microscope, being about 0.2 micrometers. Whereas some cells, like the giant amoeba or the chaos, may reach up to 1,000 micrometers, so about a millimeter in length. And even if you think about an egg, a chicken egg, that is actually a single cell. So that's a really large cell. But for the most part, cells are very, very small. Okay, so cells are very, very tiny. So in order to understand some basics about cells, you need to understand some vocabulary, which we're going to be talking about prokaryotic cells versus eukaryotic cells. So let's talk about prokaryotic cells, because these were the first organisms to evolve. Okay, so the first life on Earth was actually prokaryotic cells. And they are organisms, or they are cells that lack membrane-bound organelles. So what you're used to when you think of cells is things that have like nucleus and chloroplast and mitochondria. Well, prokaryotic cells don't have those. So all bacteria, and I'm going to go through all these because I did not organize these well. All bacteria that you think of, and all these things called archaea, which are very like bacteria, they're very similar to bacteria, are prokaryotic organisms. And they are unicellular, meaning that uni meaning one, so uni means one, so single celled. So all bacteria and archaea are single celled, having only one cell. Now, another difference between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells is that even though they both contain DNA, DNA in prokaryotic cells is not contained in a nucleus, which is what you're used to. Instead, they are contained in this thing called a circular nucleoid, which is essentially just a ball of DNA. All right, so they don't have anything outside of, like, surrounding your DNA, so there is no nucleus. Also, prokaryotic cells are smaller than eukaryotic cells. Okay, typically they're around 10 micrometers, so they're on the small end. All right, and they are much simpler. Okay, they don't have all those organelles that you think of. However, because they are living, okay, so they are living, they do perform all of the essential life functions. Okay, so they reproduce, they excrete, they have some form of nutrition, they I already said reproduce, they synthesize, digest, all those different things that everything that's living does, prokaryotic cells do. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about how they do that. The second type of cell, so there's prokaryotic cells like bacteria and archaea, and then there are eukaryotic cells. Now, these are the ones that you're familiar with, okay, because these are the ones that contain membrane-bound structures. Okay, so they have things in them like the nucleus and the Golgi apparatus and the mitochondria, anything with a membrane. So plants, animals, fungi, so like mushrooms, okay, and many single-cell organisms like yeast, okay, anything, there are single-cell organisms that are eukaryotic, but mostly when you think of eukaryotic, you think of plants, animals, and fungi, okay? And yes, fungi are fun guys. They, you should hang out with them sometime. But, and then here we go again. The last one. So they're mostly multicellular organisms, meaning that they have more than one cell. The multi and multicellular meaning having multiple. Okay, so mostly multicellular organisms with more than one cell. Instead of having DNA just kind of balled up in the center of the cell, they actually contain it in something called a nucleus, which is a membrane-bound organelle. And they contain specialized membrane-bound structures called organelles. So they have things like mitochondria, chloroplasts, lysosomes, okay, stuff like that. Your nucleus is one. And essentially what they do is they range in size from about 10 micrometers, so on the large end of a bacteria, to about 1,000 micrometers in length. So they have a large range of sizes. And they're more complex. Okay, so you can put that in there. They're more complex than bacteria. So tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit more about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, okay, and anticipate there being another lecture on plant versus animal cells for Friday. Make sure you fill these notes in, and if you have your notes filled in, then you can work on the classwork tomorrow while we're watching the lecture in class. Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow, and have a good day.